Abram was a true spiritual pioneer. He lived in a time long before the Ten Commandments were given to Moses. He lived in the 23rd century BC, and the Ten Commandments didn't arrive to Moses until the 13th century BC. So he didn't know the basic rules that have existed from the beginning of time and were not written down. And as we know, the first commandment that God gave to Moses was, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." At the same time that Moses' people were building idols to those other gods. This was a real problem in the Old Testament. The number of spiritual beings, malevolent spiritual beings, who were leading people astray, who were possessing people. And we see this in the story of Abram. Abram was visited by God, and he promised to make him the leader of a great nation. And he promised this to he and his wife, Sarai. Now, sometime later, we see that God comes back and changes his name and changes his wife's name from Abram to Abraham and from Sarai to Sarah. This additional added to the names is a strong symbol for what actually happened. We know that names are very important, and changing names are things that you really shouldn't do. But this is a good symbol for us, because first God came and said, "I'm going to make you a leader of a great nation," which would turn out to be the nation of David and the line of Jesus. Yet some other voice came in and said, "I'm going to make you the father of many nations." And with this promise, this voice convinces Abraham now to commit adultery and have a child with his slave woman. And this child ends up being the source of Islam. So yes, Abraham became the father of two great nations. But was that God's original plan? And who was this other voice that has been speaking to Abraham during his lifetime? If we follow the text of Genesis, we see that whenever Abram went south, he ran into issues, ran into trouble. And south is the direction of evil. But every time he traveled north, he came closer to God and got out of trouble. So this symbolism is an important one to remember when reading the Old Testament. Now, we look at the example of Elizabeth, and it was a miracle that she became pregnant in her old age and had John the Baptist. Well, in the end, Sarai has a child in a similar manner, which would have been a miracle. But yet this was overshadowed by the firstborn of Abrams. So now this voice comes and says, you need to sacrifice your son, Isaac. Now, which voice is this? Is this the voice that gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not have any God before me? Probably not. And it is not. Because we know that in the end, an angel of God stops Abraham from killing Isaac. And we know that Isaac is an important member of the lineage that leads through David into Jesus. That was God's plan. The one great nation that Abram was supposed to be the father of. But it's this other God, the God of the dead that Jesus tells us about, that tried to step in and undo God's plans. And that is the second voice. This is what God warned us about, is not having other gods before him. And John tells us how to test the spirits to make sure they come from God. Abram didn't know this. All this teaching came later. And so he was vulnerable to these other voices. And it's interesting, at the end of the story, these three angels show up at Abram's house. And he hides his wife, and he goes out and slaughters a calf for these three angels. Well, maybe he realized who these three were, who had been leading him astray through his life. And he created the obligatorious sacrifice that was given to these gods, a blood sacrifice, physical sacrifice. But he kept his wife away from them. Now, if these were true angels of God, his wife, he would want to experience them. But Abram knew that they weren't. Through experience in his lifetime, he knew that these were the ones who'd led him astray. So this is a very good study to understand what Jesus talks about, the God of the dead. And the God of the dead was very, very active in the Old Testament. So whenever you read something that God told us to kill, think, which God told them to kill? Was it the God who gave Moses the Ten Commandments? Or was it the God of the dead?